Many of you asked the question how to share data between components without using props or events. Well, there are two solutions, and the solutions that we are going to talk first about is context. So context is provided by React in order to help you to share data, dynamic data also, between components and pages in the same scope or in different scopes. So let's give an example. So here I got my main application, my React application, which is actually a portfolio with some elements. And I would like to wrap here this application inside one context. So what I need to do is to create a context.jsx file. And in this context, I would wrap some data that would be available everywhere in the app. Later, we're going to see that we can also create several contexts. So if you want to create several contexts for the user, for the products, for the analytics, whatever, you can create a folder context and inside create a user.jsx, which would be exactly the same as the context here, or you can call it user context, whatever. Okay, you can do that. First, what we're going to do, we are going to create one context that we are going to inject in the whole application. First thing that I need to do is to import basically React. So I'm going to type import React from React, okay. And after that, what I need to do is to create here not a conventional JSX component, but just a specific context that will be injected later. So be careful of what I'm going to do. I'm going to call React, and here I'm going to call create context, the function provided by React, and I'm going to export by default my context. Okay, now we just say to our application, hey, I'm going to create a context here, and I want you to persist the data. Okay, so once it's done, here, what I'm going to do is to go back to my main.jsx file, okay? And remember, in my main.jsx file, I got my router, which is here. And down here, I got the React DOM create root function that is going to inject my React application inside my browser here. So what I want to do is just to set up the context that will be used here inside the app. So here I'm going to do it on all routes, but if I want to do it on specific route, I can do the same operation just up here on each element. So what I want to do here is to call my context. Remember, it's a JSX component. However, this is weird because if I come back to it, it's not a component that receives a children props. And remember the children props, you can see the previous video. It's basically a props to inject different component and routes inside another component, okay? So here I got it and I want to wrap router provider with it. However, here it's not working. It's white, suddenly it doesn't work. Why? Because we didn't specify here to my context to act actually as a context. And in order to do so, and as a context component, basically. In order to do so, we need to use a native component coming from React, which is called provider. Provider helps us to say, hey, just use the state of this component element and wrap it actually to all the children. And here the children, it's router provider. Okay? So here what I'm going to do is to type point provider. And here we don't need to import anything. React understand that we talk about here a component provider. Okay, what I need to do after that is to specify a value. Why? Because here my context doesn't get any value. So I'm going to put a value which will be hello here from main.jsx. I'm going to save that and I'm going to go back to the top because I didn't import my context from context and we should be good. There we go. All right, so here we got the value. This is where you are going to store your data, okay? And this is where you are going to do the operation, the future operation. Of course, here what I could do is to have a state and I could inject this hello, and let's say that we would have a hello and set hello. I could inject hello and set hello and use set hello everywhere to change the value of hello. Probably that's what we're going to do after. Okay, so once it's done, I know that on all my routes, I would have hello from main.jsx available. I'm going to close that and I'm going to go to my home.jsx component and I would like to use this hello. So how do I do that? Well, it's basically really easy. What you need to do is basically to catch here the value. So I'm going to call it value, okay? And I'm going to call React again, and I'm going to call use context this time. So remember, on context, we use create context. Now we've got another function called use context. Create context and use context need to be called to create a context, and to use a context is it's really dumb, really easy to understand. However, here we can see that we cannot read the properties of undefined. There is no context in this context. So what I need to do is to import my context again, okay? And I need to inject it down here on my context. So I'm going to console log the value and I'm going to open here. And we can see that I got hello from main.jsx, which means that here, if I type value.hello, we can see that suddenly I got the value coming from main.jsx, okay? It's as simple as this, is as dumb as this. It's really easy to understand. You create the context, then you inject it, and there we go, you got your data. Now, what you can do is to externalize actually this whole context, this app context, okay? So what I would do here, and you are going to understand what I will try to do, is to basically get one file that got everything. It would be easier for us to understand. So I'm just going to roll back everything I did, just going to remove that. Here I got this context.jsx that I'm going to keep. And instead of my context provider, I'm going to remove it. And suddenly there is no context anymore on my application. I'm going to close everything in here and I'm going to start all over in the context.jsx file. Okay, so here I got React and I need to use create context and I need to use context. And I'm going to also to use my user state because I would like to have some persistent data. On top of it, I'm going to turn it as a use client because this is going to be actually a whole component that is going to wrap all my React application as a client. This is a choice for me. You are not obliged to do that. You can have external context exactly like I showed before. But here, this is what we're going to do. First, I'm going to create my app context with create, okay, context, okay, which will be here right now, just like this. And I'm going to export a function called app wrapper. And this function will receive the children, and you understood that the children will be actually returned from now on. Now that I got my context, I got my wrapper. At the bottom, I need to have a function that I'm going to call everywhere in my app because it will be useful. I'm going to call export function, and this time this is not going to be a JSX like this. It's going to be a use app context function that will return a use context of what you understood from the app context up here. And there we go. We've got our functional JSX component that can be used to do everything. First, to create the context, second, to wrap, and the last function that we just created, the new thing, is to use to call the context, to use and to call the context everywhere I want. Okay, but this is not over, because what we want to do is to do some kind of authentication system, and I'm going to show it to you really fast. First, I'm going to create a set user here, and here we're going to have a user. Let's say that the username would be here John Lemoine. Here, there we go, like this. Okay, we've got our user. And here, what I would like to do is basically to inject my app context, because I didn't do it, remember. So I need to call app context.provider. And here, there we go. We've got our app context.provider with the children just down here. What I need to do is to inject the value. And the value we want to inject is user and set user. And we are good, guys. We've got our whole system here with the username. Later, if I would like to fetch some data, I could have a loading state, a set loading state, for instance, on true or false, and I would display or not here this app context, which is here. Or if I use SWR, for example, I would use exactly all the keys, the same keys that we got here. Okay, so we've got everything that is in here. I got my context. I'm going to come back to main.jsx. And here I'm going to call my app wrapper, guys. Remember, the app wrapper, what is it? It's coming from the context itself. So I can go up here and import here app wrapper. From where? From here, the context. So /context. So I just wrapped here my router provider. What I can do now is to go on my hero where I got basically here the name and stuff. And let's say that after here the description of my user, so I got a verify and then I got the position and the city and stuff. Just down here, I'm going just to go here. I would like to call my function to get my user, and it's as easy as this. So here we got data coming from the config file, which is a JSON that I did on the previous course. We don't need it, we don't care. I'm just going to call my function use app context, right? So use app context is coming from where? Again, exactly from here, use app context, coming from here, the context here at the end. So context, there we go, context.jsx. And here I can call my user. So let's come back to it because I think I put here user.username. So I got that. What I can do down there is to put just here user.username. And look at this, suddenly I got John Lemoine coming from here, from my context. If I put an @ here, there we go, we can see that the value change. Okay, so now the last thing I would like to do is to say that on click, I would like to set a new user. What I can do here is to use set user, because set user is coming from here, from the context. It's injected down here. So I can click here, I can say on click set user, and I'm going to change basically here. I'm going to use previously. I'm going to keep the previous value, okay, prev. And as a username, I'm going to put, for instance, code with Guillaume. Okay, so I'm saving now, and suddenly if I click, we can see that I change the value, which is not local in here in my hero, but the value that come from the user. Let me give you some best practice and tips. Please avoid overusing context for simple props passing. However, it's very useful to use context if you don't want to do some props drilling. Use the context for global state and deeply nested component. Please consider that the context has a performance impact when you use too much templates and too deeply nested context provider. It slows down your app. Try also to compare the context with other state management tools. Probably a store will be better if you want to store a lot of data. The context API is simpler than Redux, but it might not be sufficient enough for what you want to do, especially if it's a very complex application. If you want more details, you can go on the Dev Community Guide. On FreeCodeCamp Guide, they have some chapters on context that are very useful and that I use also to make this video. Also, there are some very good Medium articles, but you can see here that in some minutes you can create a context that is very useful in all your application.